Black crime reporter outs racist cop court applauds when she's promoted. The courtroom fell silent as Elaine Johnson stood, her dark hands trembling slightly against the polished wooden railing of the witness stand. The evidence photos were displayed on the large screen for all to see, damning, undeniable proof. Detective Mercer's face had turned a dangerous shade of crimson as he glared at her from the defendant's table. "Ms. Johnson," the district attorney said, her voice cutting through the tension, "can you confirm that these case files were deliberately hidden from defense attorneys in at least 17 separate cases involving black suspects over the past decade?" Elaine took a deep breath. 20 years as a crime reporter had never prepared her for this moment, being on the other side, testifying rather than reporting. The weight of what she was about to say hung heavy in the air. "Yes," she answered, her voice stronger than she expected. "Detective Mercer systematically buried exculpatory evidence in these cases. I have documented proof that he falsified witness statements and planted evidence to secure convictions against innocent men, primarily black men from the West Side neighborhood." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harriet Washington, the first black woman to serve on the county bench, tapped her gavel once, her eyes never leaving the evidence screen. "Order," she said quietly, though there was no real need. Everyone was listening intently. Detective Mercer lunged to his feet. "This is a witch hunt. This woman has had it out for me since day one. She's just another activist with a press badge trying to sit down, Detective." Judge Washington's voice cracked like thunder, stopping him mid-sentence. "You'll have your chance to speak." Mercer's attorney tugged desperately at his client's sleeve, but the damage was done. His outburst had only confirmed what Elaine's meticulous reporting had already revealed: a man whose prejudice had corrupted his badge. Elaine's editor, Frank Daniels, sat in the front row behind her, nodding almost imperceptibly. The young intern who had helped her crack the case, Marcus Washington, looked on with wide eyes, pen frozen over his notepad. The district attorney took a step closer to the witness stand. "Ms. Johnson, your investigation suggests these weren't isolated incidents, but rather suddenly." Mercer broke free from his attorney's restraining hand and pointed directly at Elaine. "You think you're so righteous. I know things about you that would—" The judge's gavel came down hard. "That's enough. Bailiff, remove the defendant from my courtroom immediately." As the bailiff moved toward Mercer, the detective's face contorted with rage. He reached inside his jacket, and several people gasped. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Elaine Johnson sat in the witness preparation room of the county courthouse, flipping through her notes one last time. 3 months earlier, on a sweltering July morning, Elaine Johnson arrived at the offices of the Daily Chronicle carrying her usual oversized cup of coffee from Manny's Diner, the same place she'd been getting her morning fix since 1987. At 62, Elaine was the paper's longest-serving crime reporter, having covered everything from petty theft to the infamous River Road murders of 1992. The newsroom was quieter these days. Print media wasn't what it used to be back in the 70s, when Elaine had first started as a cub reporter with her freshly minted journalism degree. Where there had once been dozens of reporters typing furiously at their desks, now there were just a handful. Empty desks with dusty computer monitors served as gravestones to the newspaper industry's decline. "Morning, Frank," Elaine called out as she passed the editor's office. Frank Daniels, a man whose silver hair and perpetual frown had earned him the nickname Silver Fox among the younger staff, glanced up from his computer. At 68, he'd seen the industry transform from typewriters to Twitter, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he'd adapted grudgingly. "Elaine, got a minute?" Frank waved her in. She set her coffee down on the corner of his desk, the same spot she'd been placing it for the past 15 years, and settled into the chair across from him. "Got something interesting for you," Frank said, sliding a thin manila folder across the desk. "Gregory Watson was released yesterday after serving 8 years for armed robbery. DA's office quietly dropped all charges after new evidence emerged." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "That's the third case this year where charges were dropped years after conviction, all from the West Side, all black defendants." "Exactly," Frank nodded, "and all 3 cases had one common denominator." "Let me guess," Elaine said, opening the folder. "Detective Thomas Mercer." "Bingo," Elaine sighed. She and Mercer had a history, not a pleasant one. Since she'd started covering the crime beat in 1995, Mercer had been a rising star in the department. He'd made detective by 35 and had the highest conviction rate in the precinct. He'd also made it clear he didn't appreciate Elaine's particular perspective on his cases. "Frank, Mercer's made it his personal mission to keep me away from his investigations for years. He's not going to suddenly start talking to me now." Frank leaned back in his chair, the springs protesting loudly. That's why I'm assigning you some help. He looked toward the door and raised his voice. Marcus, come in here, would you? A young man appeared in the doorway, tall and lean, with closely cropped hair and eyes that seemed too old for his youthful face. He couldn't have been more than 25. Elaine Johnson, meet Marcus Washington, recent graduate of Columbia Journalism School and our newest intern. Marcus extended his hand, his grip firm and confident. Ms. Johnson, it's an honor. I grew up reading your coverage of the River Road case. Elaine felt a pang of something pride mixed with the sudden, sharp awareness of her age. Call me Elaine, please. Only my mother and people trying to sell me life insurance call me Ms. Johnson. Marcus smiled, revealing a small gap between his front teeth. My grandmother always said respect comes before familiarity, but I'll try. Marcus is Judge Washington's grandson, Frank added, a meaningful look in his eye. Elaine understood immediately. Judge Harriet Washington was not only the first black woman to serve on the county bench, but also had a reputation for being meticulously fair and uncompromising when it came to police procedure. If there were irregularities in Mercer's cases, having connections to Judge Washington's chambers could prove invaluable. Frank, are you suggesting we— I'm not suggesting anything, Frank interrupted, his eyes darting to the glass walls of his office. I'm simply saying that Marcus here has expressed interest in investigative journalism and you're the best we've got. Show him the ropes. Elaine nodded slowly. All right, Marcus, let's get you settled at a desk. We've got a lot of ground to cover. As they left Frank's office, Elaine's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her daughter, Michelle. Mom, don't forget dinner tonight, 7 p.m. Michael is making his famous pot roast. Elaine smiled. Her son-in-law's pot roast was legendary, a recipe handed down from his grandmother who had cooked for the famous Sutton's restaurant in the 60s. Family dinner at Michelle and Michael's suburban home had become a Thursday tradition since Elaine's husband, James, had passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. James had been her rock for 40 years, her high school sweetheart who had stood by her side as she fought to make a name for herself in a profession that had been reluctant to accept her. Everything okay? Marcus asked as they reached an empty desk near Elaine's. Just family dinner plans, Elaine replied, tucking her phone away. Now let's talk about Gregory Watson and how we're going to approach this story. For the next several hours, Elaine and Marcus pored over the details of Watson's case. According to the file, Watson had been convicted of robbing a convenience store in 2015. The evidence had seemed solid. Security footage showed a man of similar height and build. A witness had identified Watson in a lineup, and most damning of all, the stolen cash had been found in Watson's apartment. But here's where it gets interesting, Elaine said, pointing to a notation in the file. The security footage was grainy at best. The witness later admitted she was pressured into the identification, and the cash, found during a search that may have exceeded the warrant's scope. Marcus frowned. And Mercer was the lead detective. On all 3 recently overturned cases, Elaine confirmed, we need to find the connection. By mid-afternoon, they had compiled a list of everyone connected to Watson's case, the arresting officers, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, witnesses, and Watson himself. I think we should start with Watson, Marcus suggested. He's just been released. He might be willing to talk. Elaine nodded. Good instinct. Let's also reach out to his public defender, Sarah Martinez. She's been fighting this case for years, even after the conviction. She might have insights that Watson doesn't. As they gathered their things to leave, Frank emerged from his office. Elaine, a word. Marcus took the hint and stepped away, busying himself with his phone. Be careful with this one, Frank said quietly. Mercer has friends in high places, the police union, the mayor's office. He's connected. Elaine smiled grimly. So am I, Frank. So am I, as Elaine drove to meet Sarah Martinez at a small cafe near the courthouse. Her mind wandered to the changing landscape of their city. The cafe sat on the border between downtown and the west side, an area that had once been the vibrant heart of the black community before urban renewal projects of the 1970s had torn through it like a hurricane, displacing families and businesses in the name of progress. Now, sleek apartment buildings with rents no local could afford stood where family-owned shops had once thrived. It was a story Elaine had covered extensively in her early days at the paper, when her editor had reluctantly allowed her to write a series on the impact of these projects. That series had won her a regional journalism award and established her reputation as a reporter who wouldn't back down from difficult truths. Sarah Martinez was waiting at an outdoor table, a thick folder in front of her and a half-empty cup of coffee at her elbow. At 40, she had the weary look of someone who had seen too much of the system's failures. Thanks for meeting me, Elaine said, settling into the chair across from her. I read your piece on the juvenile detention center conditions last year, Sarah replied. Not many reporters are willing to dig into the ugly side of our justice system. Elaine nodded. That's why I'm here about Gregory Watson and Lewis Taylor and Darnell Wilson. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. You've connected the dots. 3 men from the same neighborhood, all convicted based on evidence handled by Detective Mercer, all now exonerated after new evidence emerged. That's not a coincidence. Sarah looked around cautiously before leaning forward. No, it's not, but I need to know what you're planning to do with this information. These men have already lost years of their lives. I don't want them becoming pawns in some political game. I'm not playing games, Elaine said firmly. If there's a pattern of misconduct, it needs to be exposed, not just for the men who have been released, but for anyone else who might be sitting in a cell right now because of Mercer's work. Sarah studied her for a long moment before nodding. Okay, what do you want to know? For the next hour, Sarah detailed the years-long battle to get Watson's case reopened. The breakthrough had come when a new prosecutor in the DA's office, Diana Chen, had agreed to review the evidence. Chen found inconsistencies in the search warrant documentation, Sarah explained. The timestamps didn't match up with officer statements. When she dug deeper, she found a preliminary lab report that was never entered into evidence, a report that showed the fingerprints on the store's cash register weren't Watson's. And this report was in Mercer's files. Elaine asked, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. That's just it, it wasn't. It was misfiled in another case entirely. Could have been an honest mistake, except the same thing happened in Taylor's and Wilson's cases, Elaine finished. Sarah nodded grimly. Exactly. Exculpatory evidence that mysteriously never made it to the defense. All 3 cases had clerical errors that just happened to benefit the prosecution. As Elaine left the cafe, her mind was racing. This wasn't just about 3 wrongful convictions. It was potentially about a systematic effort to railroad innocent men. But she needed more than suspicions and coincidences. She needed hard evidence. That evening at her daughter's house, Elaine found it difficult to focus on the family conversation. Michelle, a high school English teacher, was talking about her students' reactions to Kill a Mockingbird, while Michael served his famous pot roast. Mom, you're a million miles away, Michelle said, touching Elaine's hand. Is everything okay at the paper? Elaine smiled apologetically. Just a new story I'm working on, you know how I get. The obsessive gene, Michael teased, refilling Elaine's wine glass. Lily definitely inherited that from you. At the mention of her 15-year-old granddaughter, Elaine perked up. How is my favorite journalist in training? Still running the school paper into the ground, Michelle sighed, though there was pride beneath the exasperation. Last week's editorial on the cafeteria's use of plastic straws nearly got her called to the principal's office. That's my girl, Elaine said with a laugh. Speaking of young journalists, I've been assigned an intern, Marcus Washington, Judge Washington's grandson. Michael raised his eyebrows. Harriet Washington, she presided over a case I worked on last year, tough as nails but fair to a fault. Michael had been a social worker for the county for 20 years, often testifying in family court cases. His insights into the justice system had been invaluable to Elaine over the years. What's the story you're chasing? Michelle asked. Elaine hesitated. She rarely discussed ongoing investigations with her family, but sometimes talking through a case helped clarify her thoughts. I think I've uncovered a pattern of evidence tampering in cases handled by a certain detective. 3 men have been exonerated so far, but there could be more. Michael set down his fork. Let me guess, Thomas Mercer? Elaine stared at him in surprise. How did you know? There's been talk in the courthouse for years, nothing concrete, just whispers. The way certain cases were handled, always with the same neighborhoods, the same demographic of suspects. Michael shook his head. But Mercer's protected. His father was police chief back in the 80s, and his brother-in-law is Judge Reynolds. Elaine knew Judge Carlton Reynolds well, a stern, by-the-book jurist who had been on the bench for over 20 years. He had presided over 2 of the cases in question. That's interesting, Elaine said carefully, making a mental note to add this connection to her investigation. Mom, please be careful, Michelle said, her expression concerned. If this detective has been tampering with evidence and has connections like that, this could get dangerous. Elaine reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. I've been doing this for 40 years, sweetheart. I know how to protect myself and my sources. But as she drove home later that night, Elaine couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She'd made powerful enemies before, but if what she suspected was true, this story could shake the foundations of the local justice system. The next morning, Elaine and Marcus met Gregory Watson at a community center in the West Side. At 36, Watson looked older than his years, his face lined with the strain of his time in prison, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. "Ms. Johnson," he said, shaking her hand, "my grandmother used to cut out your articles from the paper, said you were one of the few who told our stories right." Elaine felt a surge of emotion. This was why she had become a journalist, to give voice to those who needed it most. They sat in a quiet corner of the center's library, surrounded by books and the faint sounds of a children's reading group in the next room. "I want to understand what happened," Elaine began. "From the beginning." Watson's story was all too familiar. A routine traffic stop for a broken taillight had escalated when the officer claimed to smell marijuana. No drugs were found, but Watson was detained anyway. 2 days later, he was arrested for the convenience store robbery. "I was at my sister's house when that robbery happened," Watson said, his hands clenched on the table. "She told them that. Her neighbors saw me there, but Detective Mercer said I could have left and come back, said the witness was sure it was me." "And the money they found in your apartment?" Marcus asked. Watson shook his head. "I had just cashed my paycheck, had the stub and everything, but Mercer said the serial numbers matched the stolen cash. Only found out years later that the numbers in the evidence log didn't actually match my money." As Watson continued his story, a pattern emerged: witness statements that had been altered, evidence logs with inconsistencies, a lineup where Watson had been the only one matching the witness's description. "When did you first meet Sarah Martinez?" Elaine asked. "Not until after I was convicted," Watson replied. "My first lawyer barely spoke to me, told me to take a plea deal. When I refused, the trial lasted all of 2 days. It wasn't until Sarah took my case on appeal that anyone really listened." After leaving Watson, Elaine and Marcus drove in silence for several blocks. "He lost 8 years, Marcus finally said, his voice tight. 8 years for a crime he didn't commit. And he's just one case," Elaine added. "We need to find out how many others there are." Back at the newspaper office, they began the painstaking process of reviewing every case Detective Mercer had handled over the past decade. Frank had arranged for them to access the public records database, but it was slow going. Many case files had minimal information available without a formal records request. "This would go faster if we had someone in the DA's office helping us," Marcus said as they wrapped up their 3rd day of research. Elaine looked up from her computer. "You're right. And I think I know who might be willing to talk." Diana Chen, the prosecutor who had reopened Watson's case, agreed to meet them at a restaurant well away from the courthouse. At 35, she was relatively new to the DA's office, having worked in corporate law before deciding to enter public service. "I can't be seen talking to you," she said as soon as they sat down, "and I can't give you any official documents or be quoted by name." "We understand," Elaine assured her. "We just need to know if our suspicions are on the right track." Chen looked nervously around the restaurant before speaking. "After I found the irregularities in Watson's case, I started looking at other cases Mercer handled. It wasn't hard to find problems once I knew what to look for." "How many?" Marcus asked. "At least 17 that I've identified so far," Chen replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "All with the same pattern. Evidence that was documented but never provided to the defense. Witness statements that were summarized rather than recorded verbatim, with key details changed. Search warrants with questionable probable cause." Elaine felt a chill. "And the defendants? Predominantly Black and Hispanic men, mostly from the West Side and Rivera Heights neighborhoods." Marcus and Elaine exchanged glances. Rivera Heights had been a primarily Hispanic neighborhood since the 1960s, home to many families who had come to work in the now-closed textile mills. "We need proof," Elaine said. "Documents, recordings, anything that shows this was deliberate." Chen hesitated. "I can't give you anything directly, but there's a clerk in the records department, Vivian Morris. She's been there since the flood of '94. Nothing happens in that office without her knowing about it. If anyone might be willing to help you, it's her." The next day, Elaine went alone to the courthouse records department. Marcus had offered to come, but Elaine felt that Vivian, who would remember the days when Black employees were relegated to basement offices and separate lunch areas, might respond better to someone from her own generation. Vivian Morris was exactly as Chen had described her, a no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her desk was immaculate, every file and pen perfectly aligned. "Mrs. Morris," Elaine began, "my name is Elaine Johnson from the Daily Chronicle. I was hoping I might ask you a few questions about some case files." Vivian's expression remained neutral, but her eyes swept the office, noting who might be listening. The public request forms are over there, she said, pointing to a rack of papers. Fill one out and I'll process it according to procedure. Elaine understood. This wasn't the place for their real conversation. She filled out a request form for one of the unrelated cases she was researching and handed it back to Vivian. It should be ready in 3 to 5 business days, Vivian said, taking the form. Then, her voice dropping slightly, she added, I walk in Memorial Park every evening at 5:30. The Rose Garden is particularly nice this time of year. Elaine nodded. Thank you for your help. That evening, Elaine found Vivian exactly where she had said she would be, admiring the late-blooming roses in the park's meticulously maintained garden. The park had been a focal point for civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s, and a small monument near the entrance commemorated those who had fought for equal access to public spaces. I wondered if you'd come, Vivian said without preamble as Elaine approached. I appreciate you being willing to talk to me, Elaine replied. They walked slowly along the garden path, their conversation masked by the splashing of a nearby fountain. I know why you're interested in Mercer's cases, Vivian said. I've been watching those files move for years, seen how evidence gets misfiled or how certain witness statements get updated after they're initially recorded. You've known all this time? Elaine couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Vivian gave her a sharp look. Of course I knew. You think you can work in that building for 30 years and not know who's cutting corners, but knowing and proving are two different things. So why talk to me now? Vivian stopped walking, turning to face Elaine fully. Because 3 men have finally been exonerated and still nothing changes. Mercer gets a slap on the wrist, procedural errors, they call it, and keeps his badge. Meanwhile, boys from my neighborhood are still serving time for crimes they didn't commit. She reached into her large handbag and withdrew a small flash drive. I've been making copies of the original files before they get corrected, just in case someone with courage ever decided to do something about it. Elaine stared at the flash drive. This could cost you your job. I'm retiring in 6 months, Vivian replied with a small smile. What are they going to do, take away my pension? They can try, but I've documented every irregular request I've received over the years. I'm not going down alone. As Elaine took the drive, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. I'll make sure this information is used properly. No one will know where it came from. Just make it count, Vivian said. Make it count. Back at her apartment that night, Elaine plugged the flash drive into her personal computer, never trusting work equipment for sensitive material, a lesson learned from the phone hacking scandals of the early 2000s. What she found was even more damning than she had anticipated. Vivian had compiled original witness statements alongside the corrected versions that had been entered into evidence. Photographs of evidence that had later been described differently in official reports. Internal emails discussing how to handle certain aspects of Mercer's cases. Most disturbing were the notes from Judge Reynolds, Mercer's brother-in-law, regarding how certain motions from defense attorneys should be handled. The conflict of interest was glaring, yet never disclosed. Elaine worked through the night, organizing the information and cross-referencing it with the cases they had already identified. By morning, she had a comprehensive picture of a systematic effort to secure convictions at any cost, with Detective Mercer at the center. She called Marcus as soon as it was a reasonable hour. I need you to come to my place, not the office. I have something you need to see. Marcus arrived within the hour, his expression turning grave as Elaine showed him the files. I don't even have words, he said as he reviewed an email where Mercer explicitly discussed altering a witness statement to better match the prosecution's theory. This isn't just misconduct, this is criminal. The question is, how do we proceed? Elaine asked. If we publish what we have now, they'll close ranks, deny everything, say the documents are fabricated. Marcus was silent for a moment, thinking. We need more than documents, we need someone on the inside to corroborate. A whistleblower, Elaine nodded. But who? What about Officer Rodriguez? Marcus suggested. Her name appears in several of these case files as a secondary officer, but she doesn't seem directly involved in the evidence handling. Elaine considered this. Sophia Rodriguez. She joined the force about 10 years ago. I've interviewed her a few times on unrelated cases. She struck me as straightforward. Worth a try? Worth a try, Elaine agreed. But we approached this carefully. We don't know who else might be involved. Officer Sophia Rodriguez agreed to meet them at a diner on the outskirts of town, arriving in civilian clothes with her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual tight bun. You said this was about Detective Mercer, she began without preamble once they were seated in a corner booth. What exactly are you investigating? Elaine chose her words carefully. We have reason to believe that Detective Mercer has been systematically tampering with evidence in cases involving suspects from certain neighborhoods. Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. That's a serious accusation. We have documentation, Marcus said quietly. Original witness statements that were later altered, evidence logs that don't match what was presented in court. We're not on a fishing expedition, Officer Rodriguez. Sophia was silent for a long moment. You know, I became a cop because of my uncle. He was shot during a bodega robbery when I was 10. The detective who solved his case was this old-school guy about to retire. He came to our house every week to update my grandmother, speaking to her in Spanish even though he wasn't very good at it. He cared. She looked up at them, her dark eyes intense. That's the kind of cop I wanted to be. Kind who serves the community, not whatever this is. Have you witnessed Detective Mercer tampering with evidence? Elaine asked directly. Rodriguez took a deep breath. Not directly, but I've seen enough to know something isn't right. Cases where the evidence seemed thin but convictions came easy. Witnesses who changed their stories after talking to Mercer alone. And then there was the Williams case. Terrell Williams? Marcus asked, consulting his notes. Convicted of felony assault in 2018. Rodriguez nodded. Mercer claimed Williams attacked him with a knife during a drug bust. Only problem was the knife had no fingerprints on it. None, not even partials, and the body cam footage from the arrest had a convenient technical glitch right when the alleged assault occurred. Do you think Williams was innocent? Elaine asked. I think if someone really pulls a knife on a cop, there's going to be prints on that knife, Rodriguez replied. And I think it's mighty convenient that Mercer's body cam has malfunctioned during at least 3 arrests that resulted in assault charges against suspects. Elaine made notes as Rodriguez continued, detailing other cases where she had noticed irregularities. While the officer couldn't provide direct evidence of tampering, her testimony added important context to the patterns they were seeing. As they were wrapping up, Rodriguez leaned forward. Listen, if you're really going after Mercer, you need to understand what you're up against. It's not just him. There's a whole network, cops, prosecutors, even a judge or two who have been working this system for years. Judge Reynolds, Marcus asked. Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly. You already know about that connection? Yes, Reynolds is part of it, but there are others, and they protect their own. Will you go on the record? Elaine asked. Not now, but when we're ready to publish. Rodriguez hesitated. I have a family, a mortgage. This job is all I know. We can protect your identity, Marcus assured her, but having a current officer confirm these patterns would add significant credibility to our reporting. Rodriguez sighed. Let me think about it. That's all I can promise right now. As they left the diner, Elaine felt both encouraged and concerned. They were building a compelling case, but Rodriguez was right. They were taking on not just one corrupt detective, but an entrenched system. We need to be careful, she told Marcus as they drove back toward the city. If Mercer gets wind of what we're doing before we're ready, he could destroy evidence or worse. You think he'd come after us? Marcus asked, his expression serious. I think a man who's willing to send innocent people to prison to boost his conviction rate is capable of just about anything, Elaine replied. Over the next few weeks, Elaine and Frank carefully planned their approach. They needed to gather enough evidence to make their case airtight, but they also needed to ensure they weren't tipping their hand too early. We should focus on building complete profiles of the 17 cases Chen identified, Elaine suggested during a strategy session in Frank's office. Show the pattern across multiple years and multiple types of cases. And we need to find more people willing to speak on the record, Marcus added. Former defendants' family members, maybe even other officers. Frank leaned back in his chair, considering. We'll need legal to review everything before we publish, and we should probably give the police department a chance to comment, although we'll need to be vague about our specific allegations. What about Diana Chen? Marcus asked. Will she go on the record now that we have corroborating evidence? Elaine shook her head. I doubt it. She's taking a big enough risk just pointing us in the right direction, but we should ask her if there are any other prosecutors who might have concerns about Mercer's cases. Their investigation continued to expand as they dug deeper. They discovered more cases with similar patterns, eventually identifying over 30 instances where evidence appeared to have been tampered with or hidden from defense attorneys. Elaine interviewed former defendants and their families, hearing heartbreaking stories of lives derailed by wrongful convictions. Marcus used his journalism school connections to bring in legal experts who could explain the constitutional violations involved. Then, just as they were preparing to draft their first article, Elaine received an anonymous text message. Mercer knows, watch your back. She immediately called Frank and Marcus, arranging to meet at a coffee shop rather than the office. We need to accelerate our timeline, she told them once they were settled at a corner table. If Mercer knows we're investigating him, he'll start covering his tracks. Or worse, Marcus said grimly. You saw what was in those files. He's not above threatening witnesses. Frank nodded. I'll talk to legal today. How close are we to having a publishable story? Very close, Elaine said. We have documentation for at least 20 cases with clear evidence of misconduct. We have testimony from 2 former prosecutors and several defense attorneys who noticed patterns but couldn't prove anything. And we have background confirmation from Officer Rodriguez, though she's still not willing to go on the record. What about Diana Chen? Frank asked. She's agreed to be quoted anonymously as a current prosecutor with knowledge of the cases, Marcus replied. It's not ideal, but it adds credibility. All right, Frank decided. Let's aim to publish the first piece this Sunday, front page, of course, and we'll follow up with more detailed reporting on specific cases throughout the week. As they left the coffee shop, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. She scanned the street but saw nothing suspicious. Still, she took a circuitous route home and double-checked her locks that night. The next morning, Elaine arrived at the office early to find Marcus already there, looking troubled. What's wrong? She asked as she set down her coffee. I just got a call from my grandmother, he replied. Judge Washington, she said she received an unusual request yesterday, a motion to seal several case files that we've been investigating, citing ongoing investigations that require confidentiality. Elaine frowned. That can't be a coincidence. It gets worse. The motion came from Judge Reynolds' office. They're trying to cut off our access, Elaine realized. If those files are sealed, we won't be able to cite them directly in our reporting. Grandmother said she's reviewing the motion, but she's required to give it proper consideration, Marcus said. She can't just reject it because we're working on a story. Elaine paced the small area between their desks. We need to move even faster then. Let's focus on what we already have and get the first article ready for legal review today. They worked frantically throughout the day, organizing their evidence and drafting the article that would expose years of systematic misconduct. By late afternoon, they had a solid draft to send to the paper's legal team. As Elaine was packing up to leave, her phone rang. It was Diana Chen. They're destroying files, Chen said without preamble, her voice tight with stress. I just saw Mercer and 2 other detectives removing boxes from the records room. When I asked what they were doing, they said it was part of a digital archiving project. But I know that's not scheduled until next year. Elaine's heart raced. Did you see which cases they were taking? No, but I overheard Mercer mention the Williams case specifically. The one with the knife with no fingerprints, Elaine murmured. Can you do anything to stop them? Not without exposing myself, Chen replied, but I thought you should know. After hanging up, Elaine immediately called Frank, who was meeting with the legal team. We have a problem, she told him, explaining what Chen had reported. This changes things, Frank said after a moment of thought. If they're destroying evidence, we need to go public now, even if the story isn't as complete as we'd like. But legal hasn't signed off yet, Elaine protested. I'll handle legal, Frank assured her. Start preparing a version we can publish online tonight. We'll follow with the print edition tomorrow. Elaine and Marcus worked furiously to prepare the article for immediate publication, focusing on the strongest evidence they had while being careful not to expose their sources. Just as they were finalizing the piece, Elaine's phone rang again. It was Sarah Martinez. Elaine, something's happening, the public defender said, her voice urgent. I just got notification that Gregory Watson is being brought in for questioning about a convenience store robbery that happened last week. That's impossible, Elaine said. He's been meeting with us. He has alibis. I know it's a setup. They're trying to discredit him before your story runs. Elaine felt cold anger settle in her chest. Where are they taking him? Central Precinct. I'm heading there now. I'll meet you there, Elaine decided. And Sarah, call Judge Washington's office. Let her know what's happening. Marcus insisted on accompanying Elaine to the police station. You shouldn't go alone, he said firmly, not with everything we know about Mercer. They arrived to find Sarah Martinez arguing with the desk sergeant. My client has done nothing wrong, she was saying. I demand to see him immediately. Ms. Martinez, Elaine called as they approached. What's the situation? The public defender turned, relief evident on her face. They're claiming Gregory was identified by a witness in a robbery that occurred 3 days ago. It's completely fabricated. He was with his sister at the time, just like before. Is Detective Mercer handling the case? Marcus asked. Of course he is, Sarah replied bitterly, and they're refusing to let me see Gregory. Just then, the station doors opened, and Judge Harriet Washington strode in, her judicial robes flowing behind her. At 67, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had fought for respect her entire career and wasn't about to be denied now. "Judge Washington," the desk sergeant stammered, clearly surprised. "What brings you here?" "I received a concerning call about potential witness intimidation involving a man named Gregory Watson," the judge replied, her voice calm but authoritative. "As this appears to be connected to several cases currently under review in my court, I thought it prudent to investigate personally." The sergeant looked uncertain. "Ma'am, this is an active police investigation. I'm not sure. I'm fully aware of police procedure, Sergeant," Judge Washington interrupted. "And I'm also aware of the constitutional rights of the accused. Now, where is Mr. Watson being held, and why has his attorney been denied access?" Before the sergeant could respond, Detective Mercer emerged from the back of the station, his face flushing when he saw the assembled group. "Judge Washington," he said, forcing a smile, "this is unexpected." "Indeed," the judge replied coolly. "I understand you're questioning Mr. Watson about a recent robbery." Mercer straightened his tie. "That's correct. A witness placed him at the scene." "How fortunate that you were able to identify a suspect so quickly," Judge Washington observed. "I'd like to review the witness statement and identification procedure, if you don't mind." "With all due respect, Judge, this is an ongoing investigation." "With all due respect, Detective," Judge Washington countered, "I have significant concerns about the timing of this arrest, given that Mr. Watson is a key witness in several cases being reviewed by my court. Cases involving your investigative work, if I'm not mistaken." The tension in the room was palpable. Elaine could see Mercer calculating his options, aware that he was cornered but unwilling to back down entirely. "Of course, Your Honor," he finally said. "I'll have the paperwork brought to you, but I must insist that the questioning continue as scheduled." "You may question Mr. Watson," Judge Washington agreed, "but only with his attorney present, and I will be observing." Mercer's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "As you wish." As Mercer walked away to make arrangements, Judge Washington turned slightly toward Marcus, giving him a nearly imperceptible nod. Then she followed the detective, her robes swishing authoritatively. "That was incredible," Elaine murmured to Marcus. "Your grandmother is a force of nature." "She doesn't tolerate injustice," Marcus replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Never has." Within 20 minutes, Gregory Watson was released, the witness identification having suddenly become inconclusive under Judge Washington's watchful eye. Outside the station, Watson hugged his sister, who had rushed to his side as soon as Sarah called her. "They're getting desperate," Sarah observed as they regrouped on the sidewalk. "This was a clumsy attempt to discredit Watson before your story runs." "Which means we need to publish immediately," Elaine said. She turned to Marcus. "Call Frank. Tell him what happened, and that we're ready to go live as soon as we get back to the office." That night, the Daily Chronicle's website published its explosive investigation. "Pattern of corruption: How one detective's cases reveal systematic misconduct in local justice system." The article detailed their findings about Detective Mercer's cases, the pattern of evidence tampering, and the connections that had allowed the behavior to continue unchecked for years. By morning, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The mayor called for an independent investigation. The police chief issued a statement promising a thorough internal review, and Judge Reynolds recused himself from all cases involving Detective Mercer, citing the appearance of a conflict of interest, though he vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Elaine and Marcus spent the day responding to interview requests and preparing follow-up articles detailing specific cases. By evening, they learned that Detective Mercer had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. "It's happening," Marcus said with a mixture of excitement and disbelief as they watched the police chief's press conference. "They can't sweep this under the rug." "Don't celebrate too soon," Elaine cautioned. "This is just the beginning. There will be pushback, denials, attempts to discredit our reporting or our sources." Her prediction proved accurate. The police union issued a statement defending Mercer and questioning the newspaper's motives. Anonymous sources, close to the investigation, suggested to other media outlets that the evidence had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. Most troubling, Elaine began receiving threatening phone calls, vague warnings that she should watch her back or mind her own business. She reported them to the police, though she had little faith that the threats would be taken seriously, and installed a new security system in her apartment. Despite the threats, Elaine and Marcus continued their reporting, publishing new details daily. More former defendants came forward with stories similar to Watson's. A retired prosecutor admitted to having concerns about Mercer's cases for years, but feeling powerless to act. And then, a week after their initial story broke, Officer Sofia Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. She contacted Elaine and agreed to go on the record. "I can't stay silent anymore," she explained when they met. "Not after seeing Watson arrested on fabricated charges. That crossed a line." Rodriguez provided detailed accounts of instances where she had witnessed Mercer manipulating evidence or pressuring witnesses. Most damningly, she revealed the existence of an unofficial quota system for arrests in certain neighborhoods, a system that rewarded officers for high numbers of arrests, regardless of the quality of evidence. The day after Rodriguez's revelations were published, the district attorney's office announced a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Detective Mercer. A special prosecutor was appointed to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. And finally, 3 weeks after the initial story broke, Elaine received a call from Frank early one morning. "Turn on Channel 4, he said without preamble. "They're arresting Mercer." Elaine switched on her television to see Detective Thomas Mercer being led out of the police station in handcuffs, his face set in a stony glare as reporters shouted questions. "The DA's office is charging him with evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations," Frank explained. "They're also looking at potential obstruction of justice charges related to the records that went missing after our investigation began." Elaine felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction that justice was being served, but also a deep sadness for all the lives that had been damaged by Mercer's actions. "What about the other officers involved? Judge Reynolds?" "The investigation is ongoing," Frank said, "but word is that Reynolds is planning to retire for health reasons by the end of the month. And at least 2 other detectives who worked closely with Mercer have been suspended." The case against Mercer moved forward rapidly. With Rodriguez's testimony and the documentation Elaine and Marcus had gathered, the evidence was overwhelming. Rather than face a public trial, Mercer eventually accepted a plea deal that included prison time and the permanent surrender of his law enforcement credentials. More importantly, the DA's office began the painstaking process of reviewing and potentially overturning dozens of convictions tainted by Mercer's misconduct. Gregory Watson, Terrell Williams, and others who had already been exonerated received public apologies and compensation for their wrongful imprisonment. 3 months after their investigation began, Elaine found herself back in the courthouse, this time to cover a special hearing where Judge Harriet Washington was overseeing the formal dismissal of charges against 8 more men whose convictions had been tied to Mercer's misconduct. The courtroom was packed with families, community members, and media. Elaine sat in the front row, notebook ready, with Marcus beside her. Frank had insisted on attending as well, sitting proudly behind his reporters. Judge Washington entered, her expression solemn as she took her seat. "Before we begin the formal proceedings," she said, "I want to acknowledge that what we are doing here today, while necessary and just, cannot fully restore what has been taken from these men and their families. Years of freedom, of dignity, of life itself cannot be returned. We can only move forward with a commitment to ensure that such injustices are never repeated." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom before landing briefly on Elaine. "I would also like to acknowledge the role of a free and independent press in bringing these injustices to light. Without the diligent investigation and fearless reporting of the Daily Chronicle, specifically the work of Elaine Johnson and Marcus Washington, we might never have uncovered the full extent of this corruption." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Elaine felt Marcus straighten beside her, his grandmother's public acknowledgement clearly touching him deeply. As the hearing proceeded, each man stood as the charges against him were formally dismissed. Families wept and embraced. Community advocates who had fought for years for these men's freedom exchanged relieved smiles. When the final case had been dismissed, Judge Washington made an unexpected announcement. "In light of recent events, I am establishing a new court integrity unit within this jurisdiction. This unit will be tasked with reviewing cases where there are credible allegations of official misconduct or new evidence that calls a conviction into question." She continued, "To lead this unit, I am appointing Diana Chen, whose courage in questioning established practices has been instrumental in the cases before us today." Diana Chen rose from her seat at the prosecutor's table, her expression a mixture of surprise and determination as applause filled the courtroom. Judge Washington rapped her gavel gently. And now, if there is no further business before this court, we are adjourned. As people began to file out, many stopped to thank Elaine, shaking her hand or embracing her. Mothers whose sons had been wrongfully imprisoned. Community leaders who had been raising alarms about police practices for years. Even a few younger officers, including Sofia Rodriguez, who had been inspired to push for reforms within the department. Johnson, a voice called as the crowd thinned. Elaine turned to see Gregory Watson approaching, accompanied by his sister. I wanted to thank you personally. What you did, it didn't just help me. It's going to help a lot of people who didn't have anyone to speak for them. Elaine smiled, clasping his extended hand in both of hers. You're the one who had the courage to keep fighting, Mr. Watson. I just told your story. Well, you told it right, he replied, and that made all the difference. As they left the courthouse, Frank put a hand on Elaine's shoulder. The paper's submitting your investigation for a Pulitzer, he said, and I've already approved Marcus for a staff position once his internship ends. Marcus beamed. Really, wow, thank you. Don't thank me, Frank replied. You earned it, both of you did. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Elaine paused, looking back at the imposing building that had been the site of so much injustice, and now perhaps the beginning of something better. What's next? Marcus asked, following her gaze. Elaine considered the question. She had spent decades covering crime in this city, bearing witness to both the worst and the best of humanity. At 62, some might have expected her to think about retirement, especially after such a career-defining story. But the fire that had driven her since she was a young reporter covering the civil rights demonstrations in Memorial Park still burned bright. Next, she said with a determined smile, we keep doing our job. There are more stories that need telling, more systems that need questioning. Sounds good to me, Marcus replied. I can't think of anyone better to learn from. As they walked toward the parking lot, Elaine's phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. Saw the news. So proud of you, Mom. Lily says her grandmother is a badass. Elaine laughed, showing the message to Marcus. From the mouth of teenagers. Your granddaughter has excellent judgment, Marcus grinned. A week later, the Daily Chronicle ran a special edition focused on the aftermath of the Mercer case and the reforms being implemented throughout the local justice system. Featured prominently was a photograph of Elaine Johnson being embraced by the family members of those who had been exonerated, her face reflecting both the gravity of what had happened and the hope for what might come next. The caption read simply, After 40 years in journalism, Elaine Johnson has been promoted to senior investigative editor at the Daily Chronicle, where she will mentor the next generation of reporters dedicated to pursuing truth and justice. And so, in a city slowly beginning to heal from decades of systemic injustice, a black crime reporter who had once been dismissed and marginalized found herself at the center of a transformation. She had helped create proof that the power of determined investigation and fearless reporting could indeed bend the arc of justice in the right direction. This woman has had it out for me since day one. She's just another activist with a press badge trying to sit down, detective. Judge Washington's voice cracked like thunder, stopping him mid-sentence. You'll have your chance to speak. Mercer's attorney tugged desperately at his client's sleeve, but the damage was done. His outburst had only confirmed what Elaine's meticulous reporting had already revealed, a man whose prejudice had corrupted his badge. As the district attorney approached with another question, Mercer suddenly broke free from his attorney's restraining hand and pointed directly at Elaine. You think you're so righteous? I protected this city while you wrote your bleeding heart stories. You have no idea what it's like out there. The judge's gavel came down hard. That's enough. Bailiff, remove the defendant from my courtroom immediately. As the bailiff moved toward Mercer, the detective's face contorted with rage. He reached inside his jacket and several people gasped, but he pulled out only a handkerchief, wiping his brow as he allowed himself to be escorted out. The district attorney turned back to Elaine. Ms. Johnson, your investigation has led to the review of dozens of convictions. Can you tell the court what first alerted you to these irregularities? Elaine looked out at the packed courtroom, at the families of those wrongfully convicted, at her young colleague Marcus, whose research had been invaluable, at her daughter and granddaughter sitting proudly in the back row, and began to tell the story of how truth, persistently pursued, had finally prevailed. When the hearing concluded 2 hours later, Judge Washington made her final statement. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds that a pattern of deliberate misconduct has indeed occurred. The convictions in all 17 identified cases are hereby vacated, and the Court Integrity Unit will continue reviewing all cases handled by the defendant. She paused, looking directly at Elaine. Ms. Johnson, this court owes you a debt of gratitude. Your dedication to justice exemplifies the highest calling of journalism. The promotion you've received is well-deserved, and this court applauds your commitment to mentoring the next generation of reporters. As the courtroom erupted in applause, Elaine felt tears spring to her eyes. After 40 years of fighting to be heard, of pushing against a system that had tried to silence her at every turn, her voice, and the voices of those she had fought for had finally broken through. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.